Welcome to our next session. This is the enforcement session, and I will turn the time over to Michael Dalebout.
Hello and welcome back. My name is Michael Dalebout. I'm the manager of enforcement operations here at WEC, and today my colleagues and I will be taking you through the comparative enforcement experience for our two entities that we've been discussing today, Orco and SunBear. Next slide, please. First, let me bring everybody up to speed on where the enforcement process is amongst all what we've discussed today. Enforcement resides within the part where we enter mitigation after we found a finding. So in the previous segment, we talked about the audit and the finding of SIP 10. Now we'll be going to the stage where we need to ensure that the finding was mitigated. That's where enforcement comes in. There are several steps within the enforcement area. The first being that we actually have the creation of a possible non-compliance. Then we do a triage where we look at preliminary facts and do a small study of what's going on with each case. Then we go to the validation stage where we do a full analysis of the non-compliance, followed by mitigation where we ensure that the risk to the VES has been mitigated completely. And then we issue the disposition where all the outcomes and any possible sanctions are dealt with. Next slide, please. At this point, the entities have created two PNCs. One is a self-report from Orco, the other an audit finding from SunBear Power. Both of those go into WEC enforcement at this time. Next slide. Okay, here's what we know. We've received a self-report where Orco determined, then filed a self-report stating it was in violation of the standard due to how it failed to update its supply chain risk management plan to include procurement of packs and ECOMs associated with the BES cyber systems. For SunBear Power, we had an audit finding, and the audit team found that SunBear also failed to update its supply chain risk management plan to include procurement of packs and ECOMs associated with its BES cyber systems. Next slide, please. So here is what WEC needs to process a non-compliance. In this case, we need a full description of the non-compliance. For Orco, in this case, we have it because they filed a self-report. In the case of SunBear Power, we may or may not have all the details based on the amount of time that the auditors have to discuss and explore the findings with the entity. We also need a basis for the dates that were involved in the violation. For Orco, we have those because they self-reported on it. For SunBear, it was a new finding, so we won't have those. In terms of a root cause analysis, Orco was able to perform one and provide that to us. SunBear was not, as they found out just previously, as an external finding. Orco also had a description of remediation. SunBear did not. Orco had mitigation activity details for us to look at to see how they were going to solve the problem. SunBear Power did not. So that's how we're going into this next phase. Now, what we know about the entity is, next slide, is that Orco is a GOP, as described earlier in today's presentation. They have detailed entity data available. They have good compliance history, good control, engaged and transparent. There's a lot of good things going on at Orco. What we know about SunBear, next slide, is also that they're a GOP of the similar size, but we have basic entity data available. The compliance history is a little more widely dispersed on different standards. We have poor controls. We know that there's a weak compliance program, and we know that we rarely have communication with SunBear. So with that in mind, we enter the next stage, which is starting to look at the violations. And on that note, I'll hand it over to the next slide. Michael Shaw.
Thank you, Michael. Hello, I am Michael Shaw, a mitigation engineer with WEC, and we will discuss the triage phase and what we here at WEC do. The objective of the triage phase is just as it sounds, that we assess the PNC as reported to us to determine if there is a non-compliance and the obvious risk to the BES. We will review instances of non-compliance and make an initial determination if there is a violation and how an issue will proceed through enforcement or whether additional information is needed. Obviously, high-risk matters will get our attention. Next slide, please. Let me share with you an analogy of a triage. Most of our insurances today have what you call telemedicine visits, where triage nurses help evaluate patients and decide the priority of care in an emergency room and other medical settings. When we call, a nurse listens to our symptoms and assess our need for care over the phone. From there, they let us know whether we should see a doctor, if we need to immediately go to an emergency room, or if we need to do a try-at-home treatment. At WEC, the enforcement team evaluates each P&C and decides the priority and severity of each situation. So let's look at the factors in the slide that we have here. What is our assessment of the risk and why for each of these entities? Well, with Orco, the discovery is soon after the start date of the P&C, which lowers the likelihood of potential harm. We see that they have a strong compliance program. We at WEC can determine that by looking at the COP. We see that they remediated quickly, which lowers the duration and likelihood, which could lower the overall risk to minimal. And then we also look at their overall potential risk impact. Although this entity is medium size, the work that they took to self-report a non-compliance issue, the short duration of the P&C, and also the compensating measures makes the overall risk impact change from a medium to a minimal. When we look at SunBear, the discovery is at audit and not self-identified, so the likelihood of potential harm is increased. Their compliance program lacks internal controls, and they haven't remediated quickly, which increases the duration and likelihood, which then increases the overall risk. Overall potential risk impact is either moderate or it could even be serious. Once we look at those, we then start to ask questions. One of the questions is, how were they reported? When we look at Orco, their discovery is through self-identification of a P&C. SunBear, their discovery is through an audit. We then look at their controls. With Orco, by self-identifying their problem shows they have good controls in place, good detective controls to discover the issue quickly, and then good corrective controls to remediate quickly. SunBear, on the other hand, due to their discovery being from audit, could possibly mean two things regarding their controls. One is that they're either not in place or they are in place, but they aren't being followed correctly or not being used at all. We then look at what is the risk. With Orco, their risk is minimal because of the importance of being able to identify and remediate any issues of non-compliance quickly. At SunBear, their risk is at least moderate, but could be serious due to the internal controls being lacking and not being strong. And then there's no sense of urgency in remediating their issues. How do we at WEC measure the risk? Well, there are some criteria that we look at. As I stated before, we look at the size of the entity. We look at your footprint and determine what MVA or MW is impacted. We then look at the P&C and how you as an entity address that. And then we also look at the compliance history, and not just if you have had any P&Cs at all, but we actually look to see if there's a compliance history of the specific standard that is at non-compliance. Well, not just the standard, we look at the requirement and even go down to the sub-requirement. Compliance history will be discussed more later in the presentation. From those criteria, we then analyze this P&C and then make a decision regarding the risk. Overall, when we look at this slide, we see that with Orco, the information that has been provided, their self-report process, that it will take either one or no RFIs or even meetings with this entity to get more information and to resolve this P&C. We look at the information that SunBear has provided regarding their P&C process, and it will more than likely take several meetings and RFIs with the entity to get more information to resolve their non-compliance. Thank you for your time. My colleague Trent Wilson will continue with the presentation.
Hello, everyone. My name is Trent Wilson, and I'm a senior enforcement engineer here at WEC. In the validation part of the process, we're looking at all the same information we reviewed in the triage process. However, this time we're doing a more in-depth review and formal documentation. We're also reviewing the compliance history. Next slide. The first part that we look at is the review of the non-compliance. Was there a violation of the standard, and what is the start date? The review will consist of, for Orco, reviewing the details submitted by Orco in a line or web CDMS, and for SunBear, reviewing the details in the RSAW. So we verify the start date is correct for each PNC, or what that date is. For supply chain compliance requirements, what is the effective date or implementation date of the standard? And was there a non-compliance at that date, or is it sometime after? We determine if the PNC is a non-compliance also at this time. The next part that we look at is the risk assessment and verification of the extent of condition analysis. And those two really go together. We start with the inherent risk. We look at the size of the registered entity, which we determine from the compliance oversight plan. We use our entity profile tool, which pulls from the compliance oversight plan. We can see that both of these entities are medium size. The next thing that we do is we start to look at the extent of condition. For Orco, we look at the details provided in a line or CDMS, and for SunBear, the RSAW, to determine if there was an extent of condition that was completed and what is the total number of cyber assets or MVA or MW that could be impacted. Now we determine the potential harm of the BPS for each entity. We look at the size of the entity, extent of condition. This includes the number of facilities or cyber assets or devices associated with the PNC, and also the functions of those devices or assets. We also look at the potential transmission or generation impacted, the location, if at a substation or control center or data center, and as stated before, the total MVA or MW, the total combined amount that could have been impacted. We also determine that we have this info for Orco. They reported they completed an extent of condition analysis and listed the information in the self-report. And then we also have some information from the compliance oversight plan. We don't have that same info for SunBear, so we'll need to send an RFI for more details. So far, we have determined we need one meeting or an RFI for SunBear, and we don't need any meetings or RFIs for Orco. After gathering that information for both PNCs, we determined there is a moderate overall risk to the BPS, as the PNCs and the entity size and total portions of the BPS for each entity could have been impacted. Those are both similar and moderate risk. What we do next is review the internal controls program. Does either entity have a strong internal controls program? Orco does have an internal controls program, which includes detective controls and prevention controls. We determined for Orco, they discovered the PNCs a few days after the start date. Orco also indicated in the self-report, they did have a preventative control, but it failed. So that part of mitigation, they could enhance the preventative control. Also, for Orco, they have strong detective controls. SunBear does not have detective controls. The discovery by WEC was it was 2 years after the start date of the issue. So it has taken at least 2 years for SunBear to come back into compliance, which means there were unaddressed risks to the reliability and security of the BPS. So based on the PNCs, the risk looks moderate for each entity. However, there may be compensating measures or mitigating measures which lowers the risk to minimal. Right now, as it stands, the risk for Orco may go below moderate to minimal. For SunBear, right now, it's looking like the risk will not go below moderate because of everything we've determined. We would now look at how long it took to remediate the issue and come back into compliance. If the time frame is short, that can be one factor in lowering the overall risk to minimal. And Orco remediated and came back into compliance, which within just a few days. SunBear was over 2 years. So that likelihood of potential harm is going to be higher for Orco. WEC would also look at the SIP standards and requirements or other compensating or mitigating measures in place during the duration of the non-compliance. For example, defense in depth, port protections, physical security, any compensating or mitigating measures that lower the likelihood of potential harm to the BPS. Orco indicated these in the self-report, so we did not need to send any RFIs. For Sun Bear, they provided some of these at audit, but for Sun Bear, this needs more of a review, and we will need more RFIs or meetings. At this time, WEC will not need to send any RFIs to Orco, and we've determined multiple RFIs and meetings are required for Sun Bear. We have determined also that Orco had a short duration of noncompliance, had compensating or mitigating measures, also strong detective controls in place to lower the potential harm, and that lowered the overall risk from moderate to minimal. We have determined for Sun Bear, they had a long duration of noncompliance due to no detective controls. There were some compensating or mitigating measures in place. However, the long duration of that PNC and no detective controls does not lower the risk to minimal. In fact, the risk is actually at a high moderate level and almost serious because of those facts. So that covers our risk determination. Orco is at a minimal risk, Sun Bear is at a moderate risk. The next thing that we look at is an examination of the root cause analysis description and any evidence that may have been provided already for that. WEC would look at the root cause information known so far, and if Orco provided any evidence for that in the secure evidence locker. Orco has stated in the self-report the cause was determined. Orco was able to spend more time on the cause and get to the root cause of the issue, since the issue was discovered quickly and also remediated quickly. WEC agrees with the root cause information and does not need to ask any questions or send any RFIs to Orco for the root cause information. At this time, Sun Bear hasn't started the cause analysis since this was an audit finding. Multiple RFIs and meetings are required with Sun Bear to get more cause information. Additionally, while completing the compliance history review, if we determine there are 2 to 3 prior violations with the same requirement, this could result in an aggregating factor of the disposition, and that disposition may rise above an FFT. So to summarize, at this point, Orco is very close to being able to be processed, and no RFIs or meetings are required. Sun Bear will take a longer amount of time to process. What we do further with the root cause is ensure that the mitigation, which is future prevention, has addressed the root cause. David will now present on the remediation and mitigation. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm David Bitkus. I'm a senior mitigation engineer at WEC, and we're going to talk through mitigation and compare our two entities. Next slide, please. So let's look at the analyses and compare Sun Bear and Orco quickly. For Orco, the instance was discovered quickly. Remediation was done in a very short period of time, and rapid discovery led to updates to preventative controls within about a month. Remediation was detailed in the self-report along with mitigating activities. So we contrast that with Sun Bear. The instance was not discovered quickly. There was no remediation because they didn't know about it. New processes and internal controls will need to be developed. Those mitigation efforts will likely be lengthy and could require substantial changes in the SIP program more generally. Next slide, please. So let's look at this, from a visual and work required perspective. Orco on the left, they had a failure in people and processes at a very high level in their preventative controls, but their detective controls were very good. So they reported the non-compliance, and then going forward into their mitigation, the preventative controls can be updated relatively quickly, and remediation can be almost immediate. So compare that with Sun Bear. The same failure in preventative controls around people and process results in the non-compliance, but there were no detective controls to speak of. So they're going to need to consider the technology, process, and people that are going to be required in order to move forward. So after the noncompliance is discovered, their mitigation efforts are going to rely on an extended condition to get an idea of exactly how bad the problem was over that 2-year period. Their interim risk reduction is going to be complicated because of that extended condition. And they're going to have to develop the same preventative controls, the same changes in their preventative controls around processes and people. And that could be as simple as what Orco had to do. But where the extra work really comes in is developing those detective controls, the people, processes, and technology that they're going to need to detect future issues and self-report rather than having the auditors find it at their next engagement. So, summing up, the mitigation efforts required for an entity like Orco with a mature and effective internal controls program is substantially less than the work required for an organization like SunBear, where their internal controls processes and corrective controls are not as mature. So let's talk with Dulce about how all of this factors into the dispositions. Dulce?
Thank you, David, and hello, everyone. My name is Dulce Plaza, Senior Attorney in Enforcement. Okay, so how a noncompliance or a violation is disposed of or processed as is called a disposition method. And I will now take us through walk us through and give you a better understanding of the disposition phase of the enforcement process, including explaining what each disposition method is, and then tie the disposition method process as it relates to our entities, Orco and SunBear. But I do first want to provide a little bit more of information or background information. Next slide, please. Okay, so this chart provides a general guideline for a single noncompliance that will be disposed of at a single time for U.S. registered entities. There are differences for British Columbia entities, which I will touch on throughout this presentation. The disposition document, which is the document that is filed with NERC and FERC for U.S. cases or submitted to the British Columbia Utilities Commission for British Columbia cases, will lay out the facts and circumstances of the noncompliance or violation in the form of a narrative. And that narrative will include the root cause, risk associated with the noncompliance or violation at issue, the mitigation actions, as well as other factors that were considered or relevant to the case at hand. Okay, so I'll briefly provide an overview of each of these disposition types so that we can then apply the disposition determination process to our Orco and SunBear scenarios. Next slide, please. So the term dismissal from an enforcement perspective means either what is considered a for-cause dismissal, where there is not enough evidence to support a noncompliance and therefore we have cause to dismiss, or what is considered an administrative dismissal, which is really a consolidation of a subsequent noncompliance of the same standard and requirement into an existing open enforcement action. Dismissal is also a disposition type in British Columbia. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's say a noncompliance goes through the process that our enforcement engineers have just taken you through, and the noncompliance has been determined to be a minimal risk. And assuming there are no other factors that would cause it to be elevated to a higher disposition method, the noncompliance may be processed as a compliance exception, since compliance exceptions are the disposition method used to process cases that pose a minimal risk to the bulk power system. For noncompliance process as CEs, mitigation must be either completed or the entity expects to have mitigation completed within 12 months of from the NERC filing with FERC, and that's for U.S. cases. A few benefits of the compliance exception disposition is that there's no penalty assigned or assessed, and in cases processed as compliance exceptions are generally not included in compliance history. for penalty purposes, meaning that if an entity has a prior case that was filed as a compliance exception of the same standard and requirement as the case that is currently being processed, that prior case will not be used as an aggravating factor that would increase a penalty assessed in the current case that already has a penalty associated with it. A few other notes on compliance exceptions. Once NERC files compliance exceptions with FERC has a 60-day review period. And in British Columbia, there are actually no compliance exception disposition types. Next slide, please. Okay, so for U.S. entities, FFTs represent, or find, fix, and track reports represent non-compliances that do not qualify as compliance exceptions. FFTs are typically non-compliance that are moderate risk, and like CEs or like compliance exception, mitigation for FFT non-compliance must be either completed or will be completed within 12 months of the NERC filing with FERC. And there is an additional administrative step for FFTs that to be fully, so that the FFT can be fully processed or closed out as an enforcement action. And it is that the entity is required to sign an FFT affidavit upon completion. Like with CEs, there are no penalties assigned to cases processed as FFTs, and unlike CEs, find, fix, tracks will become, find, fix, and track report FFTs will become part of an entity's compliance history and will be included in WEC's compliance history assessment for the entity as a potential penalty aggravator for future violations of the same or similar standard requirement. And like compliance exceptions, FERC has a 60-day review period to review the compliance exceptions. And from a British Columbia standpoint, the acronym FFT is short for find, fix, track, not find, fix, track, and report. British Columbia FFTs are the disposition method in British Columbia for the lesser violations, not included, and will be a part, but they will be a part of the entity's compliance history. So a few differences there. Next slide, please. So for U.S. entities, the spreadsheet notice of penalty, or S&OP disposition, is typically reserved for violations of moderate risk, but the risk is higher than that associated with an FFT. A spreadsheet notice of penalty, or S&OP, can also be a grouping of minimal and moderate risk violations being processed at the same time. S&OPs typically include a penalty, but there can be instances where we have a $0 penalty or no penalty, and they can also include non-monetary sanctions, either in lieu of or in addition to the monetary penalty. Violations processed as S&OPs will become part of the entity's compliance history and included in WEC's compliance history assessment as a potential aggravator for future violations of the same similar standard and requirement. And something else important to note here is that S&OP dispositions, we typically do use a settlement process where either the registered entity or WEC can request, can initiate settlement discussions at any time. With the settlement process, a settlement agreement with the terms and conditions of the settlement will be signed by both WEC and the entity. And then attached to that settlement agreement will be an S&OP that is drafted by WEC, which contains what I said earlier regarding the disposition, contains a narrative and the basis for the risk and the penalty and or non-monetary sanctions. And S&OP can also typically be processed faster as a full NOP disposition, mainly because there are less steps internally or from an administrative standpoint to process an S&OP settlement. FERC has, instead of the 60 days, FERC has 30 days to review, or a 30-day review period to review the settlement. And as noted on the slide here, the S&OP dispositions are not a disposition type in British Columbia. The settlement process is also not part of, not something that is done in British Columbia either. Next slide, please. All right, so a full NOP is a disposition method for serious to substantial risk violations. Now, this disposition method may also be appropriate for a registered entity that has a large number of less serious risk issues that could be aggregated into a single filing or a single disposition, a single filing, or indicative of a systemic issue. Full NOPs typically include a penalty and can include non-monetary sanctions. Like with S&OPs, violations processed as full NOPs will become part of the entity's compliance history and included in WEC's compliance history assessment as a potential penalty aggravator for future violations of the same or similar standard requirement. Like with an S&OP, the full NOP is typically resolved through the settlement process. The settlement process with the full NOP usually takes longer than the settlement process with an SNOP because full NOPs will often have to go through a much more rigorous internal review and approval process. Full NOP settlements will also require WEC enforcement to have a meeting with NERC to obtain pre-approval of the settlement and penalty even before we're able to send the proposed settlement and full NOP disposition to the registered entity and start the settlement discussions. And as with SNOP settlements, FERC does have the 30-day review period for full NOP settlements. Then from a British Columbia standpoint, just as before with SNOPs, full NOPs are not used in British Columbia. And again, the settlement process is not something that's done in British Columbia at this time. Next slide, please. And last but not least, we have the notice of alleged violation, penalty, and or sanction disposition method, or also referred to as the NAVAPS disposition. The NAVAPS disposition is not a disposition method that is often used. NAVAPS are used when resolution as a compliance exception or FFT is not appropriate and the settlement process has not been requested by the entity, or WEC has either not offered the settlement process to the entity for certain reasons, or WEC rejects the entity's request to engage in the settlement process for certain reasons. Violations processed as NAVAPS will become part of the entity's compliance history and included in WEC's compliance history assessment as a potential penalty aggravator for future violations of the same or similar standard and requirement. And processing and resolving NAVAPS dispositions will usually administratively take longer than processing an SNOP or full NOP settlements, and could also result in a hearing. As with SNOP and full NOP settlements, FERC has a 30-day to review the filed NAVAPS. In British Columbia, again, there's no SNOP or full NOP dispositions or a settlement process. In British Columbia, the only other disposition type after the British Columbia FFT is the notice of alleged violation disposition, or the NOAB disposition. This disposition is usually used in cases that are not appropriate for BC FFT treatment, so usually the higher risk cases, and they can or often include a penalty and will typically involve a longer administrative process as well that could also result in a hearing. Next slide, please. All right, so now that you have the knowledge or awareness of the different disposition methods in the US and in British Columbia, I want to circle back to our two entities, Orco and SunBear. We'll start with Orco. So our enforcement engineers told us earlier that the Orco noncompliance would likely be assessed as minimal risk. If Orco were a US entity, that would immediately trigger me to put the Orco noncompliance on the compliance exception disposition track. However, it's important to consider or remember that risk is not the only consideration to determine the disposition method. We look at other factors. For example, earlier our engineers told us that Orco had just a few prior noncompliances in their compliance history of the same standard and requirement at issue. Prior noncompliance, just by way of background, prior noncompliance can serve to elevate or aggravate the disposition track if it is determined that the current case is a repeat of the prior noncompliance. To keep things simple for the purposes of compliance history analysis, a repeat noncompliance would be one that has the same root cause as the prior, and or one that should have been prevented by the mitigation that was conducted in the prior noncompliance. In the Orco case, through further compliance history analysis, we determined that a few priors involve completely different root causes, which tells me that the current case is not a repeat of the prior cases. So again, different root causes, which tells me that this current case is not a repeat of the prior noncompliance and therefore likely not aggravating. So we also noticed that the priors, like the current case, were detected and addressed quickly and self-reported by the entity and were processed as minimal risk compliance exceptions, just like the current case. And this tells me that Orco has good controls to detect and quickly address issues. So taking this information, or based on this information, I think we can say that we do not have concerns that Orco has some bigger or systemic issues from a reliability risk or compliance risk standpoint. So for Orco, there's really no other factors that would warrant a higher disposition track, at least based on the facts that we have before us. Therefore, if ORCO is a U.S. entity, it appears that the noncompliance for the ORCO case would be processed as a compliance exception. Now, if ORCO was a BC entity, the likely disposition method would be the BC FFT disposition, again, because there's no minimal risk compliance exceptions in BC. The way you process a minimal risk is often through the BC fine fixed track disposition method. So now let's look at Sunbear. So earlier, our engineers told us that the assessed risk for the Sunbear case was at least on the higher end of moderate, but potentially serious. This tells me that if Sunbear is a U.S. entity, this case would not be appropriate for compliance exception or FFT treatment, and would at least be on an SNOP disposition track, but could potentially be on a full NOP disposition track. So let's say without looking at compliance history, we think that this is definitely a high moderate risk noncompliance that we think will go through the SNOP disposition track. But then we look at Sunbear's compliance history, and we already know from earlier that they have a much more compliance history of the same standard requirement at issue than ORCO. And further analysis tells us that Sunbear has at least 3 priors that would be considered aggravating. So this tells me that this case should likely be elevated to a full NOP. And at this point, I believe we have sufficient information to substantiate processing Sunbear's case as a full NOP disposition if Sunbear is a U.S. entity. Now, if Sunbear is a British Columbia entity, I think it's also safe to state that this case will not be considered for British Columbia FFT treatment, but for a NOAB disposition track. Next slide, please. So we'll just now step into the penalty determination aspect of disposition processing. Next slide, please. So the first part of the penalty determination is to determine a base penalty amount or base penalty range for British Columbia cases, using the factors listed here, and then adjust the penalty based on that base penalty based on any mitigating or penalty reducing factors and any aggravating or penalty increasing factors. Aggravating factors include presence of compliance history that demonstrates repeat conduct violations, otherwise known as aggravating compliance history, evidence of intentional conduct. So if the entities had a willful intent to violate the standard requirement for some reason, evidence of any actions by the entity to conceal the violation, impede the investigation of the violation, or evidence that the entity otherwise exhibited a lack of cooperation, as well as evidence of management involvement in any intentional violation or attempt to impede the investigation or to conceal the violation. Those are our aggravating factors. In terms of mitigating factors, those include the presence and quality of the entity's compliance program, the degree and quality of cooperation by the entity in the violation throughout the enforcement process and the investigation of the violation, and the self-reporting of violations. And WEC enforcement will also review filing histories of other comparable violations to ensure consistencies of the penalties assessed. Next slide, please. All right, so circling back, let's apply the penalty determination process to the ORCO and Sunbear cases. Well, for ORCO, it's easy. Earlier, we determined that if ORCO was a U.S. entity, that case would likely be processed as a compliance exception. And if ORCO was a BC entity, that case would be processed as a BC FFT, both of which, as we now know, don't involve a penalty. So which means that we don't have to go through the penalty determination process for the ORCO case, whether it's a U.S. entity or a BC entity. For Sunbear, on the other hand, we determined earlier that if Sunbear was a U.S. entity, the disposition method would be a full NOP, and if it was a British Columbia entity, it would likely be a NOAV, or a notice of alleged violation disposition. So we can, for this discussion, at least assume that the Sunbear case will have an associated penalty. So let's see if Sunbear's penalty will increase or be increased or reduced based on any mitigating or aggravating factors present. Well, we know from earlier that Sunbear's compliance history was considered aggravating, so we know that the base penalty may be increased due to compliance history. Earlier, we were also told that that Sunbear did not self-identify or self-report the violation, and instead it was identified via an audit finding. That means that Sunbear would not receive any mitigating credit for self-reporting. We were also told that Sunbear had a weak compliance program a weak compliance program with a lack of internal controls. So it would not receive any mitigating credit in this instance for its compliance program as well. And then we were also told earlier by our engineers that Sunbear provided minimal response to requests for information, which caused WEC to have to send multiple RFIs and meetings, and then multiple meetings were required with Sunbear, which delayed the processing of the case. So in sum, Sunbear has exhibited a lack of or low level of cooperation that would not warrant any mitigating credit for cooperation. It could potentially be argued, I would say, that Sunbear's lack of or low level of cooperation could rise to impediment, but I think we would need more to substantiate that such an allegation, and of course would need the supporting documentary evidence of that impediment, of the impediment, again, to substantiate that allegation. Okay, so to wrap this up, and from a key takeaway standpoint, our hope is that you were able to see how two entities of the same size with essentially the exact same noncompliance finding can have two totally different experiences, enforcement processing experiences, and ultimately result in two very different outcomes from a disposition standpoint based on the differences in various factors that potentially could have been avoided, at least from a Sunbear standpoint, could have been avoided had they had the same level of program, same level of self-identification, like Orco, and among other factors, of course. Okay, so that concludes the disposition portion of this presentation, and I believe that concludes the enforcement presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael DeLabout, Michael Shaw, Trent Wilson, David Vickers, and Dulce Plaza. Please join us in today's final session for a live enforcement Q&A and the concluding remarks.